Up next on Book TV, Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Amanda Foreman's latest book, A World on Fire, Britain's Crucial Role in the American Civil War. The Oxford historian reveals that many British citizens fought on both sides of the Civil War for a host of personal and political reasons. She talks about this lesser-known influence in the War of Secession with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Eric Foner.
I'm very happy to be speaking today with Amanda Foreman, the author of the new book, A World on Fire, Britain's Crucial Role in the American Civil War, which has gained a great deal of attention, a fascinating book, and we're going to have a nice conversation about Britain, the American Civil War, and writing about Civil War history. So, hello, Amanda.
Hello, Eric.
Maybe we can just begin by asking you, somebody said there were about 50,000 books on the American Civil War out there of one kind or another. When and why did you come to the conclusion that you had something new to say about it? How did you get into the book and get interested in it, and why did you write it?
Well, my first book was about an 18th century duchess called Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. And because of that, often the very first question I get when I'm on tour is, surely you're a tourist in the Civil War. How did you end up here? And the answer is that although I sound English, I'm actually American. My father was blacklisted during the McCarthy period, and so he moved to London, where he remarried, had a second family, and I'm the youngest product of that. But a few years on, the film industry died in England, and my father moved back to LA. And it was from LA that I actually went to boarding school in England, and that's why I sound English.
All right, I'm
anyway,
getting this straight.
Okay, but the reason why that's important is for my undergraduate, I went to Sarah Lawrence College in New York. And having had a very privileged boarding school education, I was really on the outside of many of the fundamental concerns that were exercising campuses across the United States in the late 1980s. And actually there was a sit-in at Sarah Lawrence which almost closed the college for about half a semester. And on the one hand, I found
this had to do with what, just as a matter of curiosity?
Sure, it was a general sit-in protesting a number of things, mostly to do with the lack of diversity.
I see.
They wanted a more diverse curriculum, more diversity among the faculty and among the students. And these were concerns that had never crossed my mind before at all, actually. And the more I thought about it, the more I tried to understand what was really going on, it seemed to me that actually there were two protests going on. There was the first protest of the present, and whether or not that was really grounded in reality or practicality or even the realms of possibility was one answer, which I didn't have the answers to. But the second protest was really a protest set in the past, and that every argument always ended up back in history. It was essentially the slavery debate, Civil War and Reconstruction, going back and forth on its head in 1989. So that although all my classmates went on to be gainfully employed and become doctors and lawyers, whatever else they did, I actually never moved from that spot. And I went to Oxford to study that question. It had had actually a very profound effect on me. So I did my master's on the abolition of the slave trade and the politics behind it.
Right.
And then I started a PhD on attitudes to race and colour in the long 18th century. And it was while researching Charles Grey, the politician who had proposed the motion to abolish the slave trade in 1806, I came across his mistress, the Duchess of Devonshire. And she was so fascinating that I became sidetracked, and it became a new dissertation, a new book, and then the movie. The Duchess starring Keira Knightley.
Right.
So that's how my reputation was made. But I actually always wanted to go back.
So you went back to your earlier incarnation as a Civil War or slavery historian or something like that.
That's right. But I also knew that after such a long break, I wasn't going to pick up that old dissertation. I'd moved on. And also I'd found a new topic while I was researching the Duchess. Because when I was at Chatsworth, the Devonshires had given me permission to look at all the archives of all the Dukes of Devonshire. And she had married the 5th Duke, so I went through the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th. But the 8th Duke of Devonshire, when he was a young man, the Marquis of Hartington, had actually gone out to America during the Civil War. Now, the reason he'd gone out actually was to escape his mistress, who was called Skittles.
I see.
And he couldn't afford her anymore. So rather than just fessing up, he ran off to New York thinking that she wouldn't find him. And about 2 weeks into staying at the Fifth Avenue Hotel and discovering the delights of American room service, there was a knock on his door, and it was Skittles. So he then ran to Washington, D.C., thinking that it was a one-horse town, she'd never follow him there. And of course, a week later, Skittles turned up. So he thought, okay, well, there was one place he was absolutely certain that she wouldn't get to, and that was the South, because it was 1862, the war was on. And so he and a friend got in a canoe and paddled across the Potomac, avoided the pickets, got down to Richmond, and lo and behold, she did not follow him. And then he was seduced by something even more powerful than Skittles, and that was Southern charm. And he became so enamored that actually he attached himself to Robert E. Lee and was his unofficial bag carrier for a few weeks, even made eggnog, as we know, for them on Christmas Day, 62. And so when he returned to London in the spring of 1863, he was an unofficial spokesman for the Southern cause. And yet his brother, Lord Frederick Cavendish, who shared his political opinions, they were both members of the Liberal Party, they were both liberal in terms of their attitudes to modern life and liberal politically, was pro-North. And so he had in Britain, in microcosm, the macrocosm of America.
Right. One of the interesting things in your book is, which I was really unaware of, was the number of British people who fought in the American Civil War on both sides. Sometimes the same person fought on two sides, but generally not, I guess. But why did Britons enlist in the American Civil War?
Well, it's one of those answers that run the gamut. First, and I think most interestingly, you have those who are genuinely led by ideology. And we have instances of young men who joined the North because they wanted to help free the slaves. Very few, none actually wanted to fight for the North to maintain the Union if they were coming from England. That they didn't care about. But there were those who saw slavery as the issue. But even more interestingly, and perhaps almost counterintuitively today, there were young men who joined the Southern cause and really had to endure a great amount of difficulty to get there. They had to get on a boat, they had to run the federal blockade of southern ports, and then enlist. And so they often are the most eccentric or interesting characters, to be honest.
And, I was living in London for a couple of months earlier this spring, and I think you've done this too. I went on one of these walking tours of Civil War London, and particularly Confederate London. And I was surprised, even though I've studied this period a great deal, I was surprised at how many prominent British people sympathized with the Confederacy. Members of Parliament, of course you talk about this in your book, members of Parliament, church leaders, scholars, people invested in these Confederate cotton bonds. Some went to fight, as you said, but why was there so much sympathy for the Confederacy in Britain, given, as of course you say, that Britain had already abolished slavery years before, it had abolished the slave trade many years before, anti-slavery was basically now part of British culture in a significant way. Why did so many prominent British people sympathize in one way or another with the Confederacy?
There's no easy single answer, but you can certainly piece together the answers. So, first of all, at the very beginning of the war, I think that the North was knocking at an open door. In general, most countries are not that thrilled with the thought of other countries breaking up. It's contagious.
Right.
But Seward made a fundamental mistake by...
Seward being the Secretary of State.
William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, made a fundamental mistake by pursuing this idea that if he could at least raise the spectre, if not the actuality, of a foreign war with a common enemy, and there was no greater common enemy than Britain.
Because he started out first with Spain, right? His first proposal was the U.S. should go to war with Spain. That was a non-starter. So then, he started talking in a bellicose manner about Britain.
That's right. And of course, all it did was annoy the British and convince them that his previous statements about Canada, British North America joining the constellation of the United States were actually true and not simply bloviating to the public. And so he turned Britain, which had been considering allying itself with the North, into an armed neutral, and really thoroughly annoyed British public opinion. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, ambiguity and nuance is the enemy of journalism. It doesn't really work. And so what the British public understood was that the North was fighting for empire or territory. The South was fighting for independence or freedom.
So they saw this really not as a slavery question, at least at the beginning, but as sort of local self-determination, sort of like the Greek War of Independence.